of the largest movements of the 1960s and 1970s were the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam anti-war movement. As racism and violence in America were increasing, it became clear to a group of anti-war activists that to pursue their fight against the capitalist system, they needed to change their approach from peaceful protests to a hands-on revolution. These controversial reformists became known as the Weathermen, later as the Weather Underground. While the Weathermen's militancy did not achieve their original goal to put an end to capitalism, they did succeed in challenging the government and redefining the civil rights and anti-war movements.
Two of the biggest campaigns in the United States during the 1960s were the civil rights and the anti-war movements, both of which led to the foundation of the Weathermen. During the civil rights movement, leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and their followers peacefully fought against institutionalized systems of racism and segregation. Civil rights activists were infuriated when the FBI broke into the house of Fred Hampton, a prominent Black Panther, and shot him to death. The United States was actively involved in the Vietnam War during the 1960s. The United States supported South Vietnam in the war against Communist North Vietnam. Anti-war protesters were outraged that thousands of Vietnamese people were being oppressed every day by the United States government and saw the war as a logical outgrowth of the faulty imperialist system.
3 million Vietnamese people died, at the hands of our government policy.
The Weathermen emerged from a group known as SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society. SDS provided an opportunity for college students to voice their opinions with the support of their fellow students across the country. SDS's uniting slogan was, "Let the people decide." They described capitalism and imperialism as the roots of all problems. The organization collapsed at the 1969 SDS National Convention in Chicago. After 2 days of disagreement and a walkout by a prominent faction of SDS, the organization divided. One faction of students who broke off called themselves the Weathermen, after a line in the Bob Dylan song, Subterranean Homesick Blues. The Weathermen began using forceful instead of peaceful actions in Chicago. They believed that peaceful protests were not effective in making a difference.
Radicals in this case, and they were considered radicals, took to the streets and sought out the police and other people for violence, to tangle with them physically. In the past, they were trying to be more distant to resist arrest, but this was different. They actually took the war to the streets, and that's what they wanted to do.
The Weathermen were outraged by many aspects of the United States government. They felt moral revulsion as a result of imperialism and racism, especially in African American and Hispanic communities in the U.S. In the magazine Osawatomie, the Weathermen wrote a single sentence that described their goal: mobilize the exploited and oppressed people to wage the class struggle against U.S. imperialism, the common enemy.
Our goals were economic justice or socialism, racial justice or an end to kind of white supremacy and the hierarchies of race, and global justice or peace.
The Weathermen were greatly inspired by Che Guevara, a Cuban revolutionary. They believed in his FOCO theory, which stated that a small group of revolutionaries would begin an armed struggle by attacking the government's forces, and then masses of people would follow their lead. The Weathermen also hoped to make the Vietnam War visible and to bring the war home. They did this in the form of street riots, in the hope that it would attract young people to join them.
In their attempts to achieve their goals, the Weathermen took extreme and controversial actions. The first act of violence occurred on October 8 through 11, 1969. The Weathermen faction of SDS planned an attack against cops, cars, homes, and businesses. It became known as the Days of Rage. During the Days of Rage, hundreds of Weathermen charged into police officers, broke windows, and wreaked havoc throughout the streets of Chicago. On March 6, 1970, a bomb exploded in a New York City townhouse, killing 3 Weathermen inside. This building was part of the New York City Weathermen Collective and was being used as a factory for building pipe bombs. The bomb was supposed to be set off at a police officers' club in Fort Dix, New Jersey. The explosion of the townhouse was a tragedy within the Weathermen, and caused the FBI to make it a top priority to locate them. Several weathermen were on the FBI most wanted list.
The townhouse tragedy at the townhouse catapulted us all into going underground. That really wasn't our initial plan.
The Weathermen decided in late 1969 to create a national underground organization that could carry on illegal and violent activities beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. They renamed themselves the Weather Underground Organization, partly because of the need for the Weathermen to stay hidden, and partly because of feminine opposition to the word man. On May 21, 1970, the first message, or communique, was sent from the Weather Underground. It warned that within the next 2 weeks, the Weather Underground organization would launch its first attack. 20 days later, on June 9th, the New York City Police headquarters were bombed. While underground, the organization set off a series of bombs. Each bomb sent a specific message in response to an action done by the U.S. and was accompanied by a communique. In 1971, President Nixon ordered the invasion of Laos. In response to that, they placed a bomb in the Capitol. Later that year, George Jackson, a member of the Black Panther Party, was murdered. The Weather Underground placed an explosive in the offices of the California prison system, where he was killed. In 1971, the Air Force dropped a bomb in Hanoi. In response to that, the Weather Underground struck the Pentagon.
People calling themselves members of the Weather Underground last night planted bombs in federal office buildings in Washington and Oakland, California.
While no one was injured as a result of these and other bombings, there were thousands of dollars worth of property damage.
The Weather Underground introduced a new way of rioting and standing up to the government. They planned bombings in response to specific events, let the media exploit the situation, and then sent a communique to the government, taking full responsibility for the event and explaining why they set off the bomb. The Weather Underground was never successful in achieving their original goal of ending imperialism and capitalism. The Weather Underground's actions resulted in a loss of support for the anti-war movement and gave it a bad name. Because they were, and still are, accused of terrorism, supporters of the anti-war movement were scared away. They tarnished the reputation of even peaceful protesters. The Weathermen brought fear to Americans during the Days of Rage, as well as throughout the bombings. They also led to the split of SDS, a powerful organization at the time. Without strength in numbers, the anti-war movement was weakened. They did not gain the support they had expected. The Days of Rage, for example, was expected to have a turnout of thousands of people, and instead had only a couple hundred.
I think it turned out that not enough people showed up to make it what they had hoped to.
The Weathermen, while not entirely successful, are entitled to some degree of achievement. They received lots of media attention, which opened the eyes of Americans, even more, to the things happening in both Vietnam and America. Because the FBI broke so many laws in pursuing the members of the Weather Underground, when they finally surrendered, they were not charged on very many accounts. This proved that the FBI was not invincible, contrary to the common belief at the time.
The Weather Underground changed the way Americans viewed protesters. Instead of people trying to make a point with small feudal actions, they were revolutionaries who actually posed a threat. The effects of the Weathermen can still be seen, as recent as the 2008 presidential election. Because of Barack Obama's acquaintance with Bill Ayers, Obama's judgment was questioned. The failure of the Weather Underground demonstrates that violent protests don't necessarily work. It also conveys that planning is necessary for a successful revolution. Since the time of the Weather Underground, there have not been protesters who have taken such violent actions.
The Weathermen formed in response to the civil rights and anti-war movements, with many of the same ideals as those movements. The Weathermen then split off from the organization Students for a Democratic Society. Their controversial actions failed, especially in the short term. However, their efforts did draw America's attention to the oppression occurring around the world. While the Weathermen's violent protests did not succeed in putting an end to capitalism, they did succeed in challenging the government and redefining the civil rights and anti-war movements.